Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Wildcat Wisdom online webinar on navigating the world of fake news. I'm Jen Woodside, a director in Alumni Relations. I'm joined today by Tom Haynes, a journalist and associate professor in the English department and the director of the journalism program at UNH. Tom has reported in more than 35 countries and on 5 continents. He is a former staff writer for the Boston Globe and the Seattle Times, and has also written for the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the New York Times. At UNH, Tom teaches in the undergraduate journalism program, including digital reporting workshops and upper-level courses on investigative reporting. We are excited to have Tom here today to give us tips and tools for uncovering fake news and navigating the online information ecosystem. If you have questions for Tom, please type them in the question and answer box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them as they come up. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. It's a new format for me. I'm used to being face-to-face with students here in Hammersmith, but the upside of this, of course, is that we can all be together, me here in Durham, and alums logging in from all around the country. During a lunch break or whatever break it might be, depending on your time zone. And then this presentation and our conversation can live online long afterward. So welcome. Let's get started. I just, obviously the subject today is labeled kind of fake news because that's a term we often hear. But really what we're going to be talking about today is misinformation, disinformation, and in some cases, what's referred to as malinformation. It's a timely topic, obviously. It's quickly changing, and I'm eager to talk about it with all of you. Before we do that, I just want to take a quick minute to introduce myself a little bit so you know who you're dealing with, although thanks, Jen, for that introduction, because that pretty much encapsulates it. I'm a journalist by background. I spent 18 years in newsrooms. And when I began my career in the early 90s, it was a different world information-wise. There were no cell phones. There was really no email. The World Wide Web had not yet been invented. And so I began reporting in newspapers, right, in a world of newspapers, radio, and TV, which still exists. And yet, we now have so much more going on around it in this digital, multi-platform, social media world we live in. And just a quick word about the program too. We're housed here in the English department in Hammersmith Hall. For those of you who haven't been back in a while, Hammersmith Hall is a little different after a $37 million renovation a few years ago. But it's really a great space for students and events. It's a real state-of-the-art building. As part of the curriculum, majors take a few lit classes, literature classes, everything from Shakespeare to Toni Morrison, to get a foundation in the traditions of storytelling. But the main focus of the English journalism major is a core 7-course curriculum in the craft of reporting. And for a long time, that has meant writing. The workshop model was made famous here by Donald Murray at UNH, but it's evolved in recent years as journalism has changed. And we now have a modern lab with a mobile setup, flat screen monitors on the walls. We still teach news writing, of course, the nuts and bolts of interviewing and verification, which I'll talk about a little bit today. But we also spend a lot of time looking at how to do that in a digital world, how to be a journalist in a digital world, 24/7 news, multi-platform. I'm sure all of you experience this. When you wake up in the morning, your phone is ready to go with information. And so we teach here courses in video storytelling, audio storytelling, etc. The bottom line is to try and use today's tools to be a journalist in this realm. In this semester, I'm teaching for the first time an upper-level workshop on fake news, right? The topic of today's discussion, this misinformation and disinformation that we see. The course is a work in progress. As I told the students on the first day, it's alive, and we often will blow up the syllabus from one day to the next as new developments occur. It's the kind of subject where new things are happening daily. But I'm going to draw from a lot of what we're talking about in the course today, as I hope to give you all a bit of the lay of the land of this disinformation terrain, and to kind of give some ways to think about it and react to it as it's rapidly evolving. And also to get in a little bit into some techniques and strategies to verify and fact check things for yourself on issues of importance to you. As I mentioned, it's a big topic and it is really evolving. People are New organizations are coming up year by year to kind of attempt to study and understand and react to it. Recently, the first peer-reviewed journal of research on disinformation was launched. There are numerous startups and news organizations and teams that are trying to get their hands around it and figure out how to react so that we all have new information we can count on. I will draw from one group called First Draft News in some later examples, and there will be some links in the slides that will live on after this presentation for those of you who are really interested in kind of learning more. Obviously, this is a particularly misinformation, disinformation, particularly in an election year, is a particularly fraught area in the realm of politics and cultural debate. But the reality is that decontextualized or false information moves so quickly on so many topics through the information that we come in contact with in the digital world. As Lady Gaga said, and I quote, "I'm telling you a lie in a vicious effort that you will repeat my lie over and over until it becomes true." At least that's what I think Lady Gaga said, because you can find that quote all over the internet, but I took a few minutes to try and find out, so when did Lady Gaga say that? Where did Lady Gaga say that? And it's not apparent. Obviously, I could call Lady Gaga's people and see if they could tell me. But I mentioned this for 2 points. One is just how quickly things get shared, whether we know where they come from or not. Like most of the sites with that Lady Gaga quote don't give a source, don't give an origin, don't give a context. But also the substance of that quote, if she in fact said it, really points to the stakes, that if things are not true and we repeat them over and over again, the lies become true themselves, right? And so on a bigger cultural level, the risk is that we just don't care. We stop taking things seriously. We give up on trying to figure it out, and we accept whatever we're told or kind of throw our hands up. So those are kind of the stakes of what we're talking about. So what I want to do before we go hurtling into this 24/7 world is I'm going to play a quick little video excerpt, 2 minutes long, a little bit less than that, just to remember how it was not so long ago. Some of the older alums maybe remember this world a little bit better. For those of you who are younger, more recent grads, this is the way the world used to be.
I don't need a school to just promise me.
What's that? Oh, I have to share that screen? Oops, sorry. Okay, so how do I do that? So, okay, hang on a second. Click new screen share. Okay. I'm sorry, we're just learning on the fly here. So now you can see it, right? Should be there. I can see it. I'm back to it. Now? Yeah, okay, so now I will play it. Okay, so, oh, we're back to this. Sorry. Okay, now we're here. Brave new technological frontiers.
And now for the next 30 minutes, as the world turns.
For viewers of the CBS soap opera, As the World Turns, first word came at about 1:40 p.m. Eastern Time. It happened too quickly for cameras to be in place.
And I gave it a great deal of thought, Grandpa.
Soap opera, but not for long. Soon after, Walter Cronkite was back, reporting from the CBS newsroom, complete with rotary telephones and wire machines.
This picture has just been transmitted by wire. It is a picture taken just a moment or two before the incident. If you can zoom in with that camera, we can get a closer look at this picture.
And almost exactly 1 hour after his initial bulletin, this now famous announcement.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
we are here. Okay, so we're all back together here. So, the reason why I wanted to just take a second to watch that is, first of all, just to remember how it was before the internet really came along and became sort of a mainstream networked way for us all to communicate, which is that there were sort of information gatekeepers, right? There were news stations, television stations, radio stations, and newspapers. And if you wanted to, either as a consumer of news, get it, you had to go to one of those sources. And clearly, if you wanted to really spread information, you had to have a broadcast tower or a radio signal or a printing press, and to really reach a wide audience. And yet now we obviously live in a world where these all still exist, but they are just one part of it. And just to look at that video, the photo that Walter Cronkite held up had been transmitted over a wire, printed out on a machine, put on a piece of cardboard, and he had to hold it up for the television camera to show it. And while he was able to give context and sort of speak calmly about what was going on, imagine now if there were a prominent assassination in the United States this afternoon in a public place like the Kennedy shooting happened, how many photos, how quickly things would begin to fly around on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok and Reddit and all the different sort of discussion groups and forums on the internet. That much of which could be completely legitimate. And obviously that's one of the great things of this digital world, is that we have access to a lot more information. And yet at the same time, much of the ability to separate both accurate and inaccurate, but also the ability to deceive and put things out into that stream. And you see it a lot of, particularly in these big events, oftentimes if there's a mass shooting, for example, there will be a lot of misinformation, either on the part of journalists acting too quickly or people intentionally sharing things to kind of confuse and stir the pot. And, I want to go now to, whoops, sorry, I'm just navigating around on a few different screens here. So, the good news, as I said, of course, is that real journalism does still exist. This is just a screenshot of the Boston Globe's homepage the other day. And you can still go out to places to find your information. It looks like the beer is finally flowing at the Sam Adams tap room in Boston, according to the Boston Globe. And the Senate acts to restrain Trump's military powers. And as a news consumer, you can go and read articles or watch news reports or listen to podcasts in which journalists will provide sources and evidence and information. And you can make a decision, okay, does that seem to be the full story or not? But at the same time, what we also know is that we're living in a world of this, which is, social media. This is just a screenshot from a few days ago when I searched coronavirus on Twitter. Some of the things you get. And again, immediately you get tweets. So the new coronavirus cases I'm just reading now are because they changed how they count. What about the almost 3 times deaths reported? That's because they changed how they count deaths too. It appears to be someone, although their handle is NRXR at IMNRXR, sort of just kind of asking questions about what's going on. There is a clip about a news report with some commentary. There's a clip in Spanish from a Spanish media source. But there is all of this information flowing together, and actually around something like coronavirus, a lot of misinformation, both intentional and otherwise. And so that's the big challenge, right? Is that so much of what we get now in terms of information comes from these platforms, and so we have to be able to make sense of it a bit. So I want to share a few statistics about that change, that, from the Walter Cronkite world of the 1960s of radio, TV, and newspapers to that Twitter world of today, just to give a little bit of context. So the column, the columns on the right there is age 65 plus. This is a poll of how people get their news, right? So age 65 plus, you see the longest red bar is 81% of people 65 plus get their news from TV. The next largest column is 39% from newspapers. The next column is 30% from radio. The next is 28%. They do go online, but they're going to news websites like the Boston Globe. And at least according to these respondents, only 8% get their news from social media, right? So people 65 and older, at least in this grouping, are still sort of getting their news in that old model of going to gatekeepers, TV, radio, newspapers. At the other end of the spectrum, and we'll take a quick poll here in a second online, but at the other end of the spectrum on the left, the 18 to 29-year-old, just to look at where people get their news from, the number one news source is social media, right? 36%. And so you have the younger people tend to be getting their news, right? Even if it's coming from a journalistic source, if it's a tweet from the New York Times or the Boston Globe or NHPR, they're finding it in social media, and it's living amid all this other stuff. And then the second most common source of news is online news sites, and it's decreasingly are people going out to TV stations, radio stations, and newspapers themselves. Only 2%, by the way, of young people read newspapers, which might explain a lot when you hear about what's happening in local journalism. But the point I want to make here, just simply for the context of our conversation, is how massive this shift has been over the last 10 or 15 years from people going to kind of a gatekeeper source to getting their news, but also all kinds of other information through social media platforms. So we will talk about that. Oh, before I go on, can we take a quick poll? Looks like the poll is up there, right? So how do you typically get your news? Just curious to see what kind of feedback we get from folks here. Are you seeing results? I'm not seeing results. Yeah. So what do we got here? News website is the highest, climbing. Social media 28. Huh, interesting. Okay, so with this crowd, it looks like a little more than half of the people get news from news websites. And then tied are just jumped into the lead. Social media is second, right? So people are getting, and again, to be clear, that doesn't, that means it might be a journalistic source on social media if you're following CNN or Fox or the New York Times or whatever, but it's coming to you across that platform. And they're the good old print newspapers at 14%. Okay, interesting. Do we have another poll we can take here real quick? Sorry, this is just to get a little feedback. Let's see. Yep. So if you're on social media, this is just another question to ask you here is, well, you'll see them there. Yep. All right, nice. Looks like we're getting some feedback here. Okay, so do you share information you find online, your social networks? About 2/3 of the people roughly say no, about 1/3 say yes. And if you do share, do you attempt to do it before doing so? Looks like about 2/3 of those who share try to, about 1/3 no. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because obviously one of the big challenges about digital networks and misinformation and disinformation is how fast it travels and how quickly it can move from groups to groups. So great. Okay, so thanks for the polls. Or is there a third poll? Yeah, we do have a third poll. Why not? Let's just, here we go. Here comes the third poll. Oh yeah, this is just curious to see which social media platforms do you prefer? And this also tends to correlate to age. So we got a lot of Facebook, a lot of Instagram, Twitter, not too many TikTok early adopters yet, and some Snapchat. Maybe there's a few students on the call with their Snapchat. But yeah, okay, good. So this is sort of tracks bigger statistics. Obviously, Facebook and Instagram are owned by the same, or Instagram is owned by Facebook, and they have the largest reach, but Twitter at 41%. Okay, great, because that's good to know. Thanks. We'll be talking a little bit about all of that. All right. So yeah, just to my point about the sharing question, I want to share a comment before we get into the disinformation stuff from a book that I use when I teach an introductory journalism class by Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel, called The Elements of Journalism. and obviously the quote is right there. We're witnessing the rise of a new and more active kind of American citizenship with new responsibilities that are only beginning to be considered. So what does this mean? I think their argument would mean that it means that each of us, if our aim is to gain factual information about the wider world upon which we base our decisions, about our actions and opinions, we need to become more active consumers of information, right? We need to be skeptical, for starters, and then take steps to understand what we are encountering and what it means. And obviously, this can't be a full-time job, right? There's a lot coming at us on our phones all the time. But I think the goal is that we sort of we understand that the misinformation, disinformation out there, and kind of more actively try to engage with what we see. So last thing I want to do, I just want to do a quick note. What we're not talking about today when we talk about fake news is one definition that people often think, which is kind of the political definition of someone doesn't like a newspaper report or a story on CBS Evening News, and they say, oh, that's fake news. I mean, we can talk about that at the end if you want, but I'm really talking about more this idea of misinformation and disinformation, malinformation, what experts call information disorder. And so I'd like to dive into that now. So it's to define it more carefully. So here we go. Again, as I mentioned, a lot of this stuff will come from First Draft. There will be a link to them. It's a nonprofit that's working globally right now. They do a lot of training in newsrooms and sort of just citizen education initiatives, but they've got a lot of good tools and things, so we'll be looking at those. First of which is this graphic, which I think really, it's a lot to take in at once, but I will just break it down simply. Defines these three categories, right? Misinformation. So that's just like unintentional mistakes that either maybe there's an inaccurate photo caption or a date or a statistic, or maybe there was something that was meant as satire and it got retweeted by something and you think, okay, you didn't realize it was satire, you thought it was real. You know, it's sort of like harmless intent, but was just wrong somehow. And we'll show some examples of that in a little bit. The bigger area that we're talking about is disinformation, right? Where it's like stuff is just made up, right? It's fabricated or deliberately manipulated content, often audio or visual, or it's intentionally created kind of conspiracy or rumor or misinformation just to kind of stir the pot, right? And kind of get false stories out there. There's a third category that we won't talk too much about today, but sort of, specialists would look at, which is called malinformation. You might have that's more in the realm of like doxing, if you've heard that expression, where, someone will kind of go take private information and put it out in the public sphere to kind of try and hurt someone in particular. But really what we're talking about today is more this kind of intentional and unintentional, either information that spreads around either through lack of context or through, an effort to spread false news, false information. Here's another visual representation that I'll come back to a few times, but I think this is maybe, in understanding the world of disinformation, the most helpful thing to look at to get the sense of the lay of the land. And I'll kind of walk through it from the bottom to the top. At the sort of the most kind of harmless end is satire or parody. And we'll talk about, is that really misinformation? Like maybe not at the beginning, but the point is we've probably all seen in a social network where somebody has shared something like, oh my God, check this out, can you believe it? And then you look at it, you think, wait, that was satire, they were joking, So the point is that, relatively harmless, but a kind of misunderstanding that occurs. To this next group of three things: false connection, misleading content, and false context. And that's a whole range of things where maybe a headline overstates something, the story behind it. But in a Twitter world, we all know who really reads the story before they retweet something, right? Or there's maybe some misleading content or some false context. I'll show an example of that. False context is a big one. When there's genuine content, something real, that is shared with false contextual information. Like maybe you have seen, a lot of photos is a realm of that. And then the top three are really the sort of the more serious ones, right? Where someone one category is imposter content, right? So someone makes like a bogus NBC News logo and slaps it on a Facebook page to kind of give the impression that for someone moving quickly, like psychologists who study this know that our brains, like we look for markers to confirm things. And so if you see a logo and you think, oh, that's news, you accept it more quickly. So there's people, who making stuff like that up. Manipulated content, we'll look at a few examples where videos are altered a little bit or something is changed to kind of change the narrative. And then fabricated content, which is just, flat out making up something and spreading it in the hopes of getting people confused. So just here's an example of parody, right? Pretty simple stuff. Any of you who followed the Democratic nomination process these past few weeks saw the confusion and uncertainty coming out of Iowa. The caucus results were delayed overnight as a breakdown of an app, and just general coordination of the reporting and counting broke down. If any of you are old enough to remember 20 years ago, it's hard to believe it was 20 years ago, during the Bush v. Gore Florida recount, then this little article may be humorous. It says, Florida offers to help Iowa count votes. Remember, Florida had the recount issue and the hanging chads and all these problems, and it was kind of the country was unsure for weeks, if I recall correctly, right, whether Bush or Gore were going to win. And so the joke here, of course, is that like one state that had a problem is offering another state, right? Harmless joke, funny, meant to be funny. And it is, right? It's on the New Yorker's website. It's labeled at the top, satire from the Borowitz report. But this is the kind of thing that, like, as it gets retweeted by somebody who doesn't realize it's parody, then it starts to kind of become that level of misinformation. Anyway, I just wanted to offer that as a quick example of a parody. Here are a few. I'll go a little bit more into these next three categories. So a false connection might be, and this is one where sometimes some news organizations are guilty of this a little bit, like clickbait, essentially, right? Like you try to maybe overstate what something is, and no serious newsrooms do this as far as that I've in my experience, but you'll see it right on social media stuff. You'll see headlines that are meant to pull you in, and sometimes you click through and you think, wait a minute, that's really not what's going on at all. The other two are bigger, misleading content, right? So maybe one side or another in a debate might grab the first part of a quote and circulate it as a video, intentionally making it seem to say something different. Or false context, which is when something is shared with false contextual information. I'll give an example of that. Maybe many of you have seen the photo on the left flying through social media. That's Australia, right? And these are, apparently fires all around the country. Rihanna posted it on Instagram, devastating, she said, with the little crying emoji, #Australia. This was back in early January when the fires were going on. Rihanna, by the way, has 79 million Instagram followers, right? So maybe a bunch of them are bots, but she's still got many tens of millions of followers, right? So and imagine then who reposts that, and she, put it on Twitter. So just the coverage of this photo. Now, on the one hand, Australia, there were a lot of fires, and so it's representative in a way of what's going on. But we'll find out here that it's actually not that. What this is, so this is the post by an artist named Anthony Hearsey, who had created the image and had to write a post because it got flagged, I guess, as false in Instagram, and they tagged it, and he had to explain what was going on. What it was it was an art piece that he had made where he took a bunch of data from NASA that was all the fires in Australia over the course of a year from May of 2019 to May of 2020. And he created it as kind of like a visual representation, like an artistic statement. So in a way, it's an accurate representation if you know the context of like, these are all the fires in Australia over the last 12 months, but it's not accurate in as this is Australia right now, right? And again, there can be conversations. We had a conversation in class about it where some students were saying, well, in cases like that, it's still making the point, like Australia's having these problems, we should be paying attention. And so you can debate whether or not there's much harm in that. But I think there is this kind of degrading context of if we just kind of begin to assume that things may or may not be real, right? It's a slippery slope. But again, so this is another example of kind of the more harmless kind of realm of things where there's just mistakes. Another example that you may have seen is during Hurricane Sandy, there were pictures flying around of a shark swimming down the street, right? And be like, oh my God, Hoboken, New Jersey right now. And everybody was like, you know, retweeting it or whatever. The shark was not swimming down the street in Hoboken, right? It was a photo of a shark from somewhere else. And we'll talk a little bit about like how people find this stuff out with reverse image searches, but particularly around big events, right? Either natural things or sometimes shootings or, you know, whatever. When information is in high demand and people don't have a lot of it, that's when a lot of this kind of stuff flies around that is false. So again, we'll talk a little bit about techniques for kind of being aware of this stuff, but the bottom line is just start to be skeptical for now. That's a good start. Okay, so now I want to give a few examples of the top three, which are sort of, I guess you would say, the more harmful, right, to our kind of political, civil, cultural, just our social dialogue that goes on, because if information is going around that is wrong, it becomes a problem. Imposter content, and I talked a little about that. There are fake websites, right, that go out and they literally try to be, there's a big issue right now in the 2020 election in battleground states, a lot of news organizations that are starting, and it'll be like Michigan Live, and it'll write stories that appear to be news stories, but they're run by political parties. And so then those stories will get picked up and shared in people's Facebook feeds, and obviously understood to be like real reported stories about different issues in the campaign. And meanwhile, what it is it's basically disguised messaging from the parties, right? So there's that PolitiFact, which I'll put a link to at the end, is a kind of fact-checking website, has put together a list of over 100 imposter websites. But it's kind of like whack-a-mole, you know, one of them gets found out and they just shut down and another one opens up. So anyway, a little bit on that. I'll just show just a quick example of like kind of imposter headlines, right? HIV virus detected in Walmart bananas after 10-year-old boy contracts the virus. That's on the right. And you see this CNN breaking news, but that's not really the CNN logo, but it's kind of like the CNN logo. You know, why do people do this? Either, to me, it seems like it breaks down to either money or power, right? So either someone's just trying to get rich, they get clicks, that if that gets shared on a bunch of people's Facebook feeds and they get clicks, they will get ad revenue off of that. Or if it's a different message around, you know, political stuff or whatever, it's somebody trying to get that. On the left, Sarah Palin calls to boycott Mall of America because Santa was always white in the Bible. She didn't, this is like a made up story, right? It didn't happen, but someone threw together a couple photos, threw the headline on, and started to drive some traffic, right? So you've got that kind of stuff. I'll give you an example of manipulated content. Some of you may have seen this, right? I'm gonna have to switch around the sharing again here, but let me do that. I think I've got it down now. Is it, you're seeing it? Okay, so I'll just play this quickly, right? This is a video of an interview with Nancy Pelosi. This will speak for itself, so. I always like the ads because that means somebody's paying a journalist somewhere, so.
And we thought we had some level of agreement, but you never know with this president of the United States. So that's what happened this morning. It was very, very, very strange. And we thought we had some level of agreement, but you never know with this president of the United States. So that's what happened this morning. It was very, very, very strange.
All right, let me get back to PowerPoint here. Okay, so, you know, and again, I just show that because many of you probably saw that went back around in the fall, right? In the headlines, the kind of the tags on social media was, you know, drunk Pelosi you know, talking about the president. And obviously this can be done to footage for any kind of topic. And this is a really minor example where just the frame rate was slowed down, and it kind of gave the impression that she was a little bit more slurred, or, you know, kind of not as clear in her thinking. The real area that this is going is what's called deep fakes. And this gets into more fabricated content, but where videos, basically, if there is enough content of a person out there, photo and video, and basically that's like oftentimes a lot of like politicians, celebrities, famous people, right, where there's a lot of content, or a lot of maybe younger people who've been putting their whole life on social media for a few years. The technology exists that they can basically build videos, taking bits and pieces and modeling off of it, so they can create a video that looks as though someone is saying or doing something they didn't do. At this point, it's still kind of obvious when you do that. Maybe some of you have seen these kind of deep fakes where it's a little grainy or a little jumpy. But the concern is that within 2 or 3 years, the artificial intelligence is going to be so good that they're going to be able to create, there will be videos circulating widely that it's not possible to tell are fakes. Anyway, so let me go to our last category here, which is, which is fabricated content, right? And just another quick example is, this is new content that is 100% false. And so it's designed to, you know, just kind of make people believe a story that is going on. So here I will show you, I share this one just because by one study, it was the most shared piece of disinformation in the 2016 cycle on Facebook. And I'm not sure exactly the source of how they tallied exactly that, but in a rundown of, they kind of looked at it. Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president. He didn't, right? And in some ways, you know, is somebody just having fun with this? Or is this trying to maybe, you know, sort of in the run up to the election, help make certain voters think, hey, the Pope likes Donald Trump? And again, there's this kind of disinformation on both sides going around. So I'm not trying to make a political point, but this was a very widespread piece of disinformation. And the challenge is, or the sort of the problem is, and this is the trumpet of amplification. This is the first draft put together that kind of shows that now that we live in this world, right, where there's not just the professional media at the end, right, but there is this sort of deep web, closed networks on the web, closed discussion groups, closed discussion boards, communities of people, social, and then just general social media. That a lot of this disinformation can kind of work its way from one out to the end. And oftentimes you all and me or whomever will encounter it in the social media realm. Someone, an aunt or an uncle or a friend will post something on social media, and it's come out to this point now, and then news organizations have to decide, okay, do we fact check that and debunk it, or do we ignore it? But let me just take a quick break because I think we have a question here. Let me see.
What is our defense against deep fakes? The one with Steve Buscemi and Jennifer Lawrence is scarily believable.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, I think they're trying to build, and I'm not an expert on this artificial intelligence, but it's interesting. There's an undergraduate at UNH right now who I just met with the other day, who's a philosophy and information technology major, and did his summer research project on deepfake. And the bottom line is, it's kind of a race between the quote unquote good guys and bad guys to see if we can understand deepfake technology enough to sort of almost like unprogram it. Because the technology to make it, as I understand it, is getting to the point, like you said, the Jennifer Lawrence, Steve Buscemi one is like, it's scarily believable, right? Like it's already pretty darn good. And I mean, just think about this for a second. If like the implications beyond information, but like say there was a corrupt police officer who made a video of someone breaking into a house and put it in as evidence, right? Like it could get really kind of dystopian scary. The good news is there are a lot of big companies and smart people who are also like working on ways to sleuth deepfakes, like to kind of, you know, come up with the AI technology that could unpack it. So I think, you know, I think the problem is though, that would really only get turned on the really high profile cases. And so that a lot of just what flows around our world and we see could just be fake videos that And again, is any one of them, if it's somebody, you know, if it's a celebrity saying something silly, is that going to be the end of the world? No, but if we start to live in a world where we're really not sure if anything we're seeing is true or not, it has a sort of a corrosive effect. Oh, another one. Okay, yeah, let's go for it. Great.
What is one of the most damaging examples of fake news that you've seen?
That's a great. You know, I haven't seen. I'm trying to think. Like, I wouldn't point to any one example. I think the biggest. I mean, I guess to me, the biggest damage that's been done is in our political debate on both sides. You know, it's just this idea that you kind of don't know what to believe anymore, right? And that, and again, there's a part of what I was talking about, not just the like, oh, that's fake news, I don't want to believe it, but that there are so many little micro stories being shared on social media that Donald Trump did this, or, you know, Elizabeth Warren did this, that fly around fast, that seem to kind of and they're unbelievable, they're incredible, like these things, right, in certain ways, but they kind of find a place in our heads, right? And so I think that's what it's I think the biggest damage is the cumulative effect of all the little stuff. If I were to say that, yeah. I think does that answer the question? I hope so. Another one. Yeah, let's keep going. We can, you know, it's the internet. We can stay here all day.
Someone said, I recently heard a story through NPR about Americans' inability to determine fact from opinion. How do we educate this generation of Americans who are lacking the ability to sort out fake news and opinion spun as fact? How do we ensure the next generation is better prepared?
Perfect timing, I think. Let me look at I'll try to answer that well, first of all, I think, I do think it is through just continuing to promote the idea of critical thinking generally, and kind of active individual thinking generally. And I'm not talking about just on social media, but just in life, you know, kind of really encouraging young people to do that, right? To kind of think independently and critically. In the terms of this stuff, this information, let me just say one other quick thing about this slide before we move on, but then I do get into this kind of some steps to kind of say, okay, so how do you avoid being duped, and how do you kind of be more a critical thinker in this context? Yeah, just looking at my notes here, what I want to say about this too is that the problem with like deep fakes, a lot of it is technologically driven. The problem with this funnel is that everything is amplified by first of all, by technology, right? So the bots and bot networks and sock puppets. So these are things that are basically automated identities on social media networks. You've heard about maybe Russian trolling bots or whatever. You know, these are automated things that will spread fake content so that it drives up in trending channels so that it gets a bigger audience. And then we come in because then real humans start to share it. Based on the early traffic it's gotten. And so that's the problem, right? Is that we by kind of, you know, by our own involvement and engagement with these networks, we amplify and spread the stuff. So to answer the question of what do we do? I'll start here. There's a great organization out of the Poynter Institute in Florida, which is a journalism education group called Media Wise. And they are they do a lot of this training actually specifically with high school age and college age people about just being kind of being thoughtful and aware about the sort of the media and information environment in which they live. And they've come up with, you know, 3 questions you can ask, right? And again, you're not going to be able to do this with everything that comes through your social media feed because we got to work for a living, right? We got other things to do. But if there's something that, you know, that has engaged you and either is about a subject you care about or is about something that you're involved in, these are just some really 3 basic things. Who's behind the information, right? So the idea being like, if you see something shared, who's sharing it? Like, it's just there are some easy ways to kind of start to answer that question with a click or 2 that will pretty quickly help you to understand, okay, wait, this is BS, or this is interesting and potentially legitimate. What's the evidence they're providing, right? Like that's it. You know, you'd want to do that if you're reading a newspaper article, right? So if a story makes a case about A, B, or C, it's like, okay, what's the evidence? What, you know, does the journalist cite sources and give evidence? And then the other biggest thing is something called lateral reading, essentially, is this idea. It's like, what are other sources saying? So the one benefit of the, one big benefit of the digital networks is we can check other stuff really fast, right? So I will talk a little bit about these. I'm okay. Thank you. I see a question. I might take it in a second, if that's all right. Let me just build on this for a second. And okay. Okay, yes, let me, I'll take that question in just a second, thanks. So just a little bit more detail on who's behind the information. And I don't wanna, you can read volumes on this. There is a link on this slide, this first draft guide to verification, which will take you through to much more information. But to answer the question of who's behind the information, some things you can ask is like, what's the original, what is the origin of the story? Who's the source that shared it into my network? What's the date that it came? And I'll give an example of this in a second. What's the location it came from, right? And then maybe what's the motivation? It's tougher to know, but like, you know, if there's a story that really matters to you and you want to find out, these are some things you can do. I'll give one example. It's kind of a random and interesting example. It's dated now, 9 years old. But this gentleman, Soaib Athar, @reallyvirtual on Twitter, he tweeted, "A huge window shaking bang here in Abbottabad, Kant. I hope it's not the start of something nasty." He tweeted that on May 1st, 2011. He didn't realize it at the time, but he was live tweeting. He lived in an apartment next door to the compound where Osama bin Laden had been hiding. And he was live tweeting the raid that ended up with the killing of bin Laden. And in that time, I don't have those tweets because they're 9 years old, but you could find them. But he kept tweeting a few things for a few minutes. And then a couple minutes later, he started tweeting, "Wow, media from all over the world are in my DMs right now, trying to find out." So making the point that I'm going to show you here, which is really the thing to do is, oh, it's going to involve a little screen sharing. Sorry, this is a little bit cumbersome here, but so one of the things a journalist does in that situation, when all of a sudden there were these tweets going around and news organizations started to report, hey, wait a minute, something's happening. Now this is his current page, but reporters go and they start to ask, okay, so who's sharing this information, right? And this is something that anyone can do. And I would encourage, if you're active on social networks and you follow news and information beyond just your friends, click through and find out who something is. You know, in this case, this guy says, "I'm an IT consultant on a break from the rat race by hiding in the mountains with his laptops." I remember back around 2011, his profile wasn't quite so like formal, but it was like, you know, IT, tech, Pakistan, you know, it sort of told you, okay, he happens to have a link to his website here. I won't click through it now, but if there were a link on a profile, you can click through. And then there's always the good old, you know, for journalists in particular, they will just message someone like this, either tweet at him or message him and say, "Hey, look, can we connect offline?" Right? So this is one thing that journalists try to do, is do what they've always done, which is kind of like the shoe leather, get to the source. But even us, any of us, you know, working on these networks, if there's a story that you're really skeptical about, it's worth clicking through to and just kind of starting to get a little bit of circumstantial evidence on your own of like, hey, wow, look, his Twitter thread, he does tweet about IT issues. You know, he does seem to tweet photos from around the place. You know, you start to get a little bit of comfort level, just the way what you might do in a real world conversation, picking up cues from somebody. You know, are they, is this accurate or not, kind of thing. So let me go back to, sorry, to our PowerPoint. And I will just share, there's going to be a great resource on the, so if you are geeked about this and you think, I want to become an internet detective, you will find a link here to the First Draft News Toolkit. I won't click through just because it's so cumbersome, but this essentially is like an online menu for everything. If you want to verify images, it shows you how to do what's called reverse image search, right? So say there was something on, you know, I don't know, here on UNH campus during the primary, a photo taken and it was said to be at the back of an Elizabeth Warren rally and it was kind of this outrageous photo. You can put that photo, you can just do a reverse image search where it takes that photo, Google, good old Google, Well, look and see if it's anywhere else on the internet, right? And you often see this with like wildfire photos or something. Someone will say, oh my God, look what's happening in Brazil. And it turns out it was a fire photo from 3 years earlier in India, for example, right? But that's one level. You can do that with images. You can verify video. There's different tools here to go through and verify video. Geolocation, there's some kind of tutorials on, and again, these are tools that now journalists and newsrooms are starting to use. If there is, I remember at the Globe, it was a big deal on the day of the Boston Marathon bombing. Within minutes, there was so much social media content of that awful scene, right? And on the one hand, it's reasonable to think it's all true, but if you're a news organization and are going to take that and tell your readers or your audience that this is true, you need to verify it. And so this is what a lot of these journalists were doing. They were looking at geolocation tags. Oh, was that Instagram post really posted from Boylston Street, or was there no geolocation tag? In which case you start to think, or take it. They would do a reverse image search. Has this photo ever appeared on the internet before? If it hasn't, it increases the likelihood. So you start to chip away and find out what's up. The other good tools I will mention down the right-hand column here is they have some tools for Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just some cool stuff. Who posted what? Like, it's ways that you can find out who first posted stuff on Facebook. So, again, if you're really active in a cause in your community and you see a bunch of dubious stuff floating around your social networks, you can become like, the detective and kind of share with your audience, hey, you know what? This thing's been going around, but I see that it's been posted in 9 Facebook groups across the country, and each, whatever the situation might be. Again, there's some stuff for TikTok, but nobody here is on TikTok, so we won't worry about it. But again, I would point you to that in that, there's a lot of stuff out there. And First Draft is just one of the organizations that's done a good job kind of bringing that together. Okay, so again, just to summarize, I think that to me at the first level, if you are, can I go to that question? Because I think this might be a good time to, sorry, I'll come back to it. But the question was, this is scary for me, especially in an election year, because I barely have time to read the news, never mind sorting out what is real and what is not. So I usually check out NPR, NHPR, or BBC, or a few other sites, but are these sites, quote, safe? Yeah, I mean, so let me, I'll address the 2 parts of the question. So as far as the scary stuff and, sorting out what's real and what's not, I mean, I think I would just point to the stuff I'm just talking about source and date and location is a good way to kind of get a little bit of a handle on that if you're wondering. But as you point out too, you don't have time to check all that. So yes, I would say my answer, I mean, maybe, I'm a journalist, but I think if it's an established news source, particularly NHPR, NPR, BBC, these are organizations that, and I'll talk at the end, they work with a scientific method, right? They do original reporting. If they're doing their job right, they're showing you the source of their information, or they're telling you the source of their information. They're hopefully giving some evidence to that. They're telling you what they don't know, and so I think, I know that people have debates if they say, oh, well, my politics are this, I don't like that news organization or whatever. And I'm not talking about like the evening cable shows where everyone is screaming and arguing their case. But I'm saying if you're looking at really verified reported journalism, which is, covering communities and covering issues, yes, I mean, I think that's the idea. It's like, you still have to think critically is, does the reporter back up the main point of the article with sources and evidence? But I think, yes, those are safe in the sense that that's their job. They're trying to track stuff out. Okay, perfect. I have 5 minutes, I think. So let me, and there's 2 questions. So let me just fly through a couple of slides here. Again, just a quick note on the other thing you can do is open a tab in your browser and search. So if you see some crazy story, right? Did something happen? Google, did that happen? And chances are, if it's a big enough story, it's going to already be getting covered. And there are specifically a few organizations, people might know Snopes. BuzzFeed does a really good job with, I won't open it up right now, but here's a running list of disinformation spreading about the coronavirus. This woman, Jane Litvinenko, is a reporter at BuzzFeed. Her job is to debunk widespread fake news. And so there is, I'm going to do it. I'm going to use some of my 5 minutes to do it just because it's kind of an impressive thing to look at. in that, so they've put together an article that is a running article. You guys have it there, right? That is all the stuff, right, about coronavirus flying around the internet that is fake, false, misleading, all those different categories we were talking about, right? And here, the BuzzFeed journalist has done the things I'm talking about, like she would maybe look at the origin, where did it come from, how was it posted, they'll look at contextual information, or they'll get a hold of the actual people, they'll do reverse image searches, but you find, and so increasingly, newsrooms, it's a new job for journalists, right? To be kind of fact checkers, to be, and again, they don't want to, we can't do everything. And you don't want to amplify something that isn't already out there broadly. But when something as important as the coronavirus, and when there's this much misinformation flowing around, they say, hey, so we'll do that. So I will jump back to this. But I think, for those, if you are worried about this, I think check some of these sites for big stories. And also, yes, I mean, I think you can, I would definitely count on the established professional news organizations as the source that are going to tell you what you need to know. And this is my ending right here. So I will end on this point. Getting to good old journalism, right? This is again from Kovacs and Rosenstiel. 5 elements of the scientific method of journalism is, originality. Do you do your own work, right? Transparency. Do they say this is the source and here's the evidence and here's what we know? Humility, which means essentially, do they say what they don't know and what's not known, as opposed to kind of assuming that everything is known? And then the last 2 are kind of important for journalists, but behind the scenes, you don't add anything, you don't deceive anything. But I think if we all kind of think a little bit like journalists as we navigate our social networks, and we look and say, hey, is this original? Did someone really kind of create this? Did they show me some sourcing and evidence? It's the beginning of starting to kind of feel like you at least know when something is suspect. And that's kind of maybe the best we can hope for right now on a lot of this stuff. So there were a couple questions. Do I have time to answer 1 or 2 of them?
Yes, you do. What happens when the major networks and major cable networks are guilty on a regular basis of fabricated content, false content, misleading content, and false connections?
So I guess I would ask, for like specific, it's hard to answer without specific examples. I would draw a connection between the reported news that they're giving on like their news programs and a lot of these cable shows where they'll bring on factions from different sides and they essentially argue over whether something is right or wrong. Let's set that aside for a minute because it's a different thing. I would say what I see, and if you look at these, so say the New York Times writes a story and there is a factual error, they will run a correction. And if you read a story in the New York Times and it is factually inaccurate, then that's good critical thinking reading. But I think oftentimes the criticisms I'll hear of kind of the mainstream press is that they are wrong, they make stuff up. But what is made up, I guess, is a question I'm asking, and what facts are wrong? I think there's oftentimes a dismissal of like the whole side of the argument, when in reality, if you take an article and you circle the sources and the evidence, is that accurate or not? And I think that's where you have to make your decision.
And then another question, would you please comment on opinion pieces and editorial columns versus news reporting? I think people often mistake the two as equals. Even on NPR and other organizations, you can tell the political bend of the interviewer based on their questions or follow-ups.
Yeah, I agree. And it drives me nuts. This is one of the big changes in the digital platforms versus the old world. It used to be, if you read the daily newspaper, you would know when you were on the opinion page and you would know you're reading an editorial and there might be somebody on the right or somebody on the left or somebody in the center. And that was their point, was they were making an argument. That still all exists now. But for example, if I follow the Washington Post on Twitter, that one tweet might be a news article written by an investigative reporter that is meant to just be telling you the facts. And the next tweet might be an opinion piece from somebody arguing about the impeachment hearings. And I think to all of us on the internet, then it all becomes very blended. And we think, oh, the Washington Post has this opinion about the impeachment hearings, when really what it is, the opinion writer for the Washington Post has that thing. So I think that is one of the biggest problems, is that the prominence of opinion journalism now is so much more than it used to be. It used to be proportional. It used to be you would read the news, and then maybe at the end of the evening newscast, someone would come on and give a talk, or at the back of the newspaper section, there would be a few editorials. Now, and again, the example of cable TV news, they have 24 hours a day. They have to fill it with something, right? So they put all these people on TV shouting about what's right and what's wrong. And I think that we would all be better off if the proportion of just fact-based reported news was higher, and we spent more time ourselves thinking how we feel about it, rather than, everyone trying to convince everybody.
And then one final question. What is the best way to confront a friend or a colleague about posting something that you find is fake?
Interesting. I mean, I think if you wanted to kind of do, I don't know that I'm just making this up on the end here because I haven't really thought about this too much, but I think use some of these tools. Maybe just if you think if someone's sharing something that's fake, I say, where did this come from? It's interesting. How do you know that's true? It doesn't seem like it's true to me. Do you know who originally posted this? Because it kind of then puts it on that person to, if they are sharing something, to sort of, and I have a few people in my feed, right, who share things that I know to be false, and that's a good way to do it. I think is ask them some of those questions. Where did it come from? Who posted it? When was it first posted? What's their proof? This is interesting. Okay, so if this party is doing all this stuff or whatever, what's the proof behind it? I see the headline, I see the story. A lot of these stories, I will say one thing, if you want to do a little study, get yourself a news organization website and read the article and look at their sourcing and evidence, and then read one of these kind of fake news stories and write down all the sources they cite. And it will not be a very long list. They'll be very general. It will be, anyway, I think that's the difference. And so that's what I encourage all of you is kind of, hold the journalists to high account by who are their sources, what's the evidence.
Well,
I hope that was helpful. Thanks for all the good questions.
yeah.
Sorry we couldn't all hear each other's voices. Come to Ham Smith sometime and we can talk in person.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. We'll send a follow-up email with the links so you can examine some of this information more, and we hope to see you on another webinar in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.